Welcome back to the deep dive. If you're looking for the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed about world history, you already know the stakes. Sometimes a single historical artifact doesn't just record the past, it provides a template for understanding diplomacy that holds true thousands of years later, and that's precisely what we're exploring today, the Egyptian-Hittite Peace Treaty.
It's sometimes called the Eternal Treaty.
Right, or the Silver Treaty, because of the material it was recorded on. This document, ratified around 1259 BC, holds the undisputed title of the oldest known surviving peace treaty in human history. Our mission today isn't just to talk about this piece of history, but to really unpack the motivations behind it. We're taking a deep dive into the dual texts, analyzing the startling content of the agreement, and most importantly, revealing the intense, cold political calculations that compelled the two greatest superpowers of the late Bronze Age.
Ramesses II of Egypt and Adetuli III of the Hittite Empire.
Exactly. To transform them from these bitter, mortal enemies into, well, indispensable strategic allies.
And for you, the listener, this is a phenomenal deep dive because we get to do a rare comparative analysis. I mean, in ancient history, you often only get one side of the story, usually the victors.
Or just whoever's records happen to survive.
Right. But here, the versions from each party, the Egyptian text and the Hittite text, have survived. We can lay them side by side.
That's incredible. So we can actually compare their official perspectives directly.
We can. And we can see the real political pressures driving the deal. This treaty, you have to understand, it wasn't some sudden, heartfelt truce. It was the formal end to a systemic conflict over control of the Eastern Mediterranean that had been destabilizing the region for over 200 years.
2 centuries.
The tension was immense, the cost of war was becoming completely unsustainable, and the need for a durable, mutually beneficial agreement was absolutely critical for the stability of the entire late Bronze Age system.
So to really appreciate how revolutionary this Eternal Treaty was, we first have to go back. We have to confront the historical ghost that looms over the entire document. The Battle of Kadesh.
Oh, absolutely. This epic confrontation fought roughly 15 years before the treaty was signed, so around 1274 BC. It was the boiling point.
Fought near the Orontes River in modern Syria.
Exactly. And Kadesh really represented Egypt's long effort to reclaim its international standing. They were trying to recover territories in northern Syria that had been lost, mostly during the internal chaos of the Amarna period, the time of Akhenaten.
Right. When Akhenaten moved the capital and his focus was entirely internal, the Egyptian network in Syria just collapsed.
It created a power vacuum, and the Hittites just swept right in. So Ramesses II, who was desperately trying to recapture the military glory of pharaohs like Thutmose III, he saw reclaiming Syria as completely essential to his own legacy.
And his legitimacy.
His legitimacy, absolutely.
So Ramesses marches north with 4 huge divisions, an immense logistical undertaking for the time, but the campaign, it goes catastrophically wrong almost immediately.
It's a classic case study in military overconfidence and just terrible intelligence.
What would happen?
Well, the Egyptian accounts, which you have to take with a grain of salt because they're massive propaganda pieces.
Of course.
But they contain kernels of truth. They tell us that Ramesses marched far ahead of his main forces. He pitches camp near Kadesh after his scouts capture 2 local nomads.
And these nomads feed him some information.
They do. Under duress, they offer what Ramesses' people see as reliable intelligence. That the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, is hundreds of miles away in Aleppo, supposedly terrified of the Egyptian advance.
And Ramesses just buys it. He takes the bait.
Hook, line, and sinker. He sets up camp for his lead division, the Amun division, completely unaware that Muwatalli II had pulled off a piece of strategic genius.
He was hiding his army.
A colossal army. Some sources suggest over 40,000 men, maybe 3,500 chariots, concealed perfectly behind the Tell of Kadesh, just waiting for the Egyptians to separate their forces.
And as soon as Ramesses' Amun division is pitched,
the Hittites launch a devastating surprise chariot attack. They just tear through the Egyptian advance forces, scattering them completely.
So Ramesses II, the great pharaoh, suddenly finds himself in a truly dire life-or-death situation. He's isolated, scrambling to organize a defense, literally fighting for his life.
He was saved by 2 key factors, which, his monuments conveniently downplay.
I'm sure they do.
First, his personal guard, the near-in, they managed to rally enough of the shattered troops to hold a defensive line. Second, and this was crucial, a contingent of relief forces arrived just in time to flank the Hittite chariots, forcing a tactical retreat.
Wow. So the result was just chaos, a massive loss of life, and in the end, a stalemate.
Precisely, and this is the key. Ramesses spent the rest of his very long reign propagating the story that Kadesh was a splendid victory. But the scholarly consensus today is crystal clear. It was inconclusive.
He survived, but he didn't win.
He survived the ambush, he avoided total annihilation, but he failed completely in his strategic objective. He couldn't capture Kadesh, he didn't destroy the Hittite army, and he immediately retreated back to Egypt.
It's just the ultimate example of historical revisionism through art, isn't it?
Oh, the scale of the propaganda effort is mind-boggling. Ramesses inscribed the Kadesh narrative across multiple temples in 3 distinct forms. The poem, which is this heroic narrative, the bulletin, a more factual military report, and then the elaborate pictorial reliefs at places like Abu Simbel.
And every single one focused on his personal, almost godlike ability to defeat his enemies by himself.
Single-handedly. He went home claiming he had crushed his foes beneath his sandals.
But, of course, the Hittites knew the truth.
They absolutely did. While Ramesses was busy commissioning monuments, the Hittites were making political and strategic moves. Muwatalli successfully extended their buffer zone with Egypt further south, and significantly, they retook the vassal state of Amuru, which had been sort of playing both sides.
So Ramesses' victory story was completely contradicted by the actual map of power in Syria.
Completely. And this brings us to that crucial 15-year gap between the battle and the treaty. This was not a period of peace.
Far from it. This was what scholars call the inconclusive decade, right? Characterized by more of Ramesses' campaigns.
Expensive, but ultimately fruitless campaigns. He launched major operations in his 8th and 10th years. He even managed to conquer a city called Dapur, hoping to establish a permanent Egyptian foothold in central Syria.
But those efforts were a logistical nightmare to sustain, weren't they?
They were doomed to failure. The Egyptian army would capture a city like Dapur, but maintaining supply lines that far from the Nile Delta was just unsustainable. As soon as Ramses' main army pulled back, the territory always reverted to Hittite control.
So the great pharaoh finally had to confront the reality that he couldn't match the dominance of someone like Thutmose III in Syria.
The cost-benefit analysis just didn't work, so the period between Kadesh and the treaty was less a full-scale war and more of a tense, grinding standoff, what you could call an ancient Cold War.
They avoided another huge direct battle, but the border was contested, territory was raided, and the 2 great powers were locked in this destructive stalemate.
And that political exhaustion is the true birthplace of the Eternal Treaty. It wasn't signed in the heat of the moment. It was a pragmatic solution born out of mutual, logistical, and financial exhaustion.
Okay, so let's turn to the actual artifact itself, the famous Silver Treaty. Now, the sources say the original text was inscribed not on clay, but on solid silver tablets.
And that choice of material is immediately significant. Silver was incredibly valuable. Its use just underscores the extreme gravity and high status of this agreement. It was a physical symbol of parity and wealth exchanged between 2 equal royal houses.
But those original silver tablets are long gone.
Lost to history, unfortunately. But their contents were thankfully preserved in more permanent media by both sides.
The Egyptian text was key to the early understanding. Where exactly was that found?
It was permanently engraved on the walls of 2 of Ramesses' most important religious structures in Thebes. At the Ramesseum, his memorial temple, and also on a wall at the huge precinct of Amun-Re at the Temple of Karnak.
So putting the treaty text in those sacred places,
Yeah.
it was a signal that this was divinely sanctioned, a key part of his legacy.
Exactly. And the discovery goes way back. Jean-François Champollion, the man who cracked hieroglyphics, he was one of the first to copy a big part of the text back in 1828.
And the Egyptian version had a fascinating detail, didn't it? Something beyond just the words.
It did. The scribes didn't just copy the text. They included detailed descriptions of the actual physical object that the Hittites delivered, specifically the figures and seals that were impressed onto the silver tablet.
That's amazing. It's like a description of the diplomatic packaging.
It gives us a visual record of a lost artifact, reinforcing the formality of the whole exchange.
But the real mic drop moment, the confirmation that this wasn't just Ramesses' side of the story,
Yeah.
that came much, much later.
It came in 1906. A German archaeologist, Hugo Winkler, was excavating the Hittite capital, Hattusa, in modern Turkey. And there, he found the royal palace archives.
An astonishing find. How many tablets?
Around 10,000 baked clay tablets, all inscribed with cuneiform, detailing centuries of diplomatic and government activity.
10,000.
Yeah.
And somewhere in that massive library.
He found fragments of 3 different tablets that contained the Hittite version of the treaty. And here's a crucial detail. The text wasn't in the local Hittite language. It was in Akkadian cuneiform.
Why Akkadian?
Because Akkadian was the undisputed lingua franca of the time. It was the common, universally understood language of diplomacy and trade across the entire Near East.
The equivalent of using English for international diplomacy today.
Precisely. Its use signaled international legitimacy and guaranteed the message would be understood without any translation errors.
So Winkler's reaction to finding this must have been just electric.
It was legendary. He wrote about finding this marvelously preserved tablet and realizing that finding Ramses writing to Hattusilus about their treaty confirmed that the famous text from Karnak could now be seen from the other side.
He knew he had both halves of the story.
He noted the content was identical, word for word, with parts of the Egyptian version, but preserved in beautiful cuneiform. This discovery didn't just confirm a treaty. It confirmed the political extensions and sophistication of the Hittite Empire itself, which had been, lost to European scholars for millennia.
And you can still see its legacy today.
Absolutely. A copy of this ancient document is prominently displayed on a wall at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, a powerful recognition of its status as the earliest, fully documented international agreement.
So let's get into the document itself. What did it actually say? You mentioned the symmetry, that they were treating each other as absolute equals.
The symmetry is the most striking part. It reflects that parity of power they'd reached. The text is just a series of reciprocal obligations. Whatever promise Egypt made to Hatti, Hatti made right back to Egypt.
So what was the big overarching promise?
Well, the high-level promise, the window dressing, if you will, was the pledge of brotherhood and peace forever. And it wasn't temporary. It explicitly bound the children and the grandchildren of both kings.
So the goal was to remove this historic enmity for all future generations.
That was the idea. But the functional core, the real meat of it, rested on 2 major pillars.
Okay, what's pillar number 1?
First, the mutual guarantee, a promise not to invade the other's land. This formally recognized the existing spheres of influence in Syria. Ramesses officially gave up his claims to northern Syria, and Thessaloniki affirmed Egypt's control over the southern Levant.
They stopped fighting over the border by finally agreeing on where the border was.
Exactly. And the second pillar is where it becomes clear this is so much more than just a peace agreement. It's the alliance clause.
This is the critical shift.
It is. The treaty mandated mutual military aid. If either king was attacked by an external enemy, the other was immediately obligated to send military support, troops and chariots.
And it went beyond external threats, right? It was about internal stability, too.
It was a full-service security pact. The alliance was explicitly triggered if either side faced internal rebellion or insurgency. This meant Egypt was formally committed to preserving Hattusili's reign against his own domestic enemies, and vice versa.
A mutual regime survival guarantee. That raises the stakes considerably. This isn't just about territory, it's about guaranteeing the ruling dynasties.
It is. The language is so clear. It says something like, "And if another enemy come against the land of Hatti, the great king of Egypt shall send his troops and his chariots and shall slay his enemy." The commitment was total.
The document also had another crucial element, something we see in modern treaties, an extradition clause.
This was vital, and perhaps the most urgent point for Hattusili. Each country swore a divine oath to capture and repatriate political refugees and fugitives back to their home country.
And we're not talking about petty thieves here. We're talking about serious threats to the throne.
Almost exclusively. In the Bronze Age, if a disgruntled royal family member fled to a rival empire, they became a huge political bargaining chip. By forcing extradition, both kings prevented their enemies from using exiled figures to stir up trouble.
So given these high-stakes, dynastic survival, mutual defense, they needed a guarantor greater than themselves. This is where the divine enforcement came in.
And they treated this with the ultimate seriousness. The agreement was sworn before 1,000 gods, male gods and female gods, from the pantheons of both Hatti and Egypt.
And they didn't stop at the gods. They invoked the physical universe itself.
That's the amazing part. They called the natural world to witness. The mountains and rivers, the sky, the earth, the great sea, the winds, the clouds. A violation wasn't just a political breach. It was a violation of cosmic order.
And the penalty was designed to be terrifying.
He was a deterrent for generations. The penalty was a divine curse. The god shall destroy his house, his land, and his servants. But if you adhered to it, you were promised health and life.
This level of detail brings us back to that scholarly debate. Is it even right to call this a peace treaty?
Well, early analysis, like from James Breasted, saw it as a straightforward termination of war. But later scholarship, from people like Trevor Bryce, challenged this. They argued the true function was to establish a mutually beneficial strategic alliance driven purely by expediency and self-interest.
So the Brotherhood and Peace Forever part was essentially marketing.
Essentially, yes. The consensus is that it was fundamentally a high-level security pact. And you can see this in the preambles, which reveal the different goals of the two kings. The Hittite version tries to smooth things over, saying something like, the god does not permit hostility between them.
Framing it as this natural, inevitable peace.
Right, whereas Ramesses, who never missed a propaganda opportunity, took a much harder line.
Of course he did.
The Egyptian version, carved on his temple walls for his people to see, states straightforwardly that the two states had been at war, and it was his power that brought the Hittites to the table. The Hittite preamble tries to legitimize the peace. The Egyptian one tries to legitimize Ramesses.
This difference in the preambles confirms they came to the table with very different needs. So let's look at that great game. What were the pressure points on each monarch?
If you look at the political context of the time, the consensus is pretty clear. Attuli III was the far more desperate party. He was almost certainly the one who sued for peace.
And his biggest vulnerability was at home, right? The legitimacy crisis.
It's a huge crisis. He was, in the eyes of many Hittite nobles, a usurper. He had seized the throne from his own nephew, Orhi-Tesub, so his grip on power was always a bit shaky. And that internal problem became an external threat because guess where his deposed nephew, Orhi-Tesub, was living?
In Egypt, being harbored by Ramesses.
Exactly. Ramesses held the most dangerous political leverage imaginable over the Hittite king. As long as he sheltered Orhi-Tesub, he could use him as a puppet to destabilize the Hittite throne.
So the treaty was pure political survival for Ettushilia. It neutralized that threat by forcing Ramesses to stop protecting his rival, and it guaranteed Egyptian support for his own successors.
It turned a political liability into a powerful international endorsement. But if the internal threat was Orhi-Tesub, the external threat that truly tipped the scales was the relentless rise of Assyria in the east.
Tell us more about Assyria. They were the real disruptor here.
Assyria was the upstart power of the Late Bronze Age. Their military machine was rapidly expanding. Ettushilia's predecessor had already suffered a huge loss when Assyria seized Hanagalbat, a vital Hittite vassal state.
And that meant the Assyrians were now positioned directly on the Euphrates River.
Right on their doorstep, in prime position to launch further attacks into the Hittite heartland. For Ettushilia, the danger from Assyria was immediate and terrifying. It far outweighed the benefit of trying to grab a few more miles of land in Syria. The alliance with Egypt became an essential military shield.
So just to sum that up for the listener, Ettushilia's position was basically, Assyria's coming, and I need this treaty to survive both a foreign invasion and an internal challenge to my throne. The cold, efficient calculation.
It is. Now let's pivot to Ramesses. He's in a relatively stable position at home. He survived Kadesh. Why did he, the mighty pharaoh, agree to a symmetrical treaty with his rival?
That's a great question. If he was stable, why not just let the Hittites worry about Assyria?
It was a decision driven by realism and economics. After 15 years of those fruitless campaigns, Ramesses finally accepted that permanent Egyptian control over northern Syria was, in his mind, unrealizable. Continuing the war meant only mounting costs with zero long-term gains.
So he realized he couldn't win militarily, but he could still win diplomatically and financially.
Correct. By accepting the existing borders, Ramesses could immediately pivot his resources. Ending the costly wars let Egypt secure access to critical trade routes and ports in Hittite territory as far north as Ugarit. The economic gain was massive.
And the Assyrian threat wasn't just Ettushilia's problem, was it?
Not at all. Ramesses was a smart strategist. He knew if Assyria completely devoured the Hittite Empire, that aggressive power would suddenly be on Egypt's doorstep. Maintaining a stable Hittite empire as a buffer state was vital to Egypt's own long-term security.
And finally, you can't ignore the biggest motivation for Ramesses, the propaganda. He failed to conquer Syria, but he absolutely won the PR war back home.
This is his crowning achievement. Since Ettushilia approached him, Ramesses spun the entire thing as a colossal personal triumph. On his monuments, he explicitly depicts the settlement as one the Hittite king had asked for in a position of submission.
He used the independence of his own inscriptions to reshape the historical narrative for his own people.
He did. The treaty allowed him to claim he had conquered the Hittites through diplomacy, cementing his supremacy without having to fight another costly battle.
So the ultimate success story here is that even though this treaty was born out of shared fear and political desperation, it actually worked. It created a genuine and lasting peace.
It really did. With the fighting over, Ramesses could finally divert massive resources from his military into his famous domestic construction projects. I mean, most famously, the monumental temples at Abu Simbel. The peace enabled the great architectural legacy we associate with him.
And the relationship blossomed beyond just military guarantees. It became a true dynastic bond.
That's the ultimate sign. In the 34th year of Ramesses' reign, the alliance was cemented by a dynastic marriage. The pharaoh married a Hittite princess, an event that would have been unthinkable just 20 years earlier.
And this mutually beneficial peace lasted entirely free of conflict between the two giants. For how long?
Until the Hittite Empire ultimately collapsed nearly a century later, ironically falling to pressure from Assyria and the mysterious Sea Peoples, the very threats the treaty was partly designed to contain.
So what does this all mean for us today? Our deep dive shows us that this ancient document was less about a simple desire for peace and more about mutual defense, securing trade, and critically legitimizing a precarious monarch.
The profound insight here is that geopolitical alliances are, and perhaps always have been, less about abstract moral goodness and more about shared existential fear and cold, hard political expediency. These are the engines that drive the most durable international agreements, whether in the late Bronze Age or today.
It's a striking continuity of power politics. But let's go back to the seriousness of the contract itself, that cosmic obligation.
The treaty required Ramesses and Attishiliu to swear an oath before 1,000 gods and the natural world itself, the mountains, the rivers, the sky. Violating that pact guaranteed a divine curse that would destroy entire dynasties.
Which raises an important question for you, the listener, today.
When nations sign treaties in the modern era, what modern equivalent of a divine or natural endorsement do they appeal to? And how does the absence of such a serious supernatural curse, a guarantee of cosmic destruction, change the calculus of violating an international agreement? Think about what happens when honor and security are no longer enforced by the gods themselves. Think about that as you process this deep dive.
You know, it happens like almost every day. You're sitting in the office or maybe you're hanging out with a friend and they straighten a stack of papers or align their pens and they laugh and say, "Oh, I'm just so OCD about my desk."
Right. Yeah, we hear it all the time.
It's totally become this casual, everyday shorthand for just, being tidy or liking things organized.
Which is really a shame, honestly.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you look at the clinical reality, it is a staggering contrast.
Oh, absolutely. Night and day.
We are doing a deep dive today into a really comprehensive medical and psychological breakdown of obsessive-compulsive disorder. We're going to look at the symptoms, the underlying neurological causes, and the treatments.
And it's such an important topic for you to understand because the reality is that OCD affects about 2.3% of people globally at some point in their lives.
Wow, 2.3%. That's a lot of people.
It is. And for those people, it is not just some quirky preference for neatness. It's an exhausting and honestly often terrifying loop of intrusive thoughts and rituals.
And it typically consumes, what, more than an hour of their day? Every single day, right?
At least an hour, yes. Understanding OCD isn't just about memorizing diagnostic criteria. It is about understanding what happens when the brain's internal alarm system gets stuck in the on position.
Just constantly ringing.
Exactly. Unpacking this material today is really how we build crucial empathy for a condition that is so widely misunderstood and, quite frankly, trivialized in our everyday language.
Yeah, trivialized is the perfect word for it. So to really get our heads around this, we have to start at the core, like the anatomy of this loop.
Right. The disorder is essentially split into two distinct halves.
First, you have the obsessions. And to be clear, these are not just intense interests or hobbies.
No, not at all. They are persistent, unwanted, and highly stress-inducing thoughts or mental images or urges.
We're talking about like an intense fear of contamination, or a desperate need for symmetry, or even a crippling fear that you might accidentally harm someone you love.
Yeah, and those obsessions generate an incredible amount of anxiety, disgust, or just profound discomfort.
Which makes sense. If you think you're going to hurt someone, you'd be terrified.
Exactly. And that surge of negative emotion forces the second half of the disorder into play. Compulsions.
Right. The things you do to stop the feeling.
Yes, compulsions are the repetitive actions or even mental acts that the person feels completely driven to perform. They do it to try and reduce that anxiety or to prevent some dreaded event from happening.
So we're talking about, excessive hand washing, checking locks over and over, counting to specific numbers, or just constantly asking friends for reassurance.
Yeah, checking behaviors are huge.
But here is the cruel trick of the disorder, though. The compulsion provides this, temporary relief from the panic, but it actually reinforces the obsession over time.
It totally feeds it.
It's like having a really bad mosquito bite. In the moment when the anxiety is spiking, scratching that bite feels like the absolute only way to get relief. You have to do it.
Right, the urge is overwhelming.
But by scratching it, you're inflaming the area, you're damaging the skin, and ultimately, you are making the itch come back even stronger and worse than before.
That is a perfect analogy. You are feeding the cycle every single time you engage in the compulsion.
It sounds like a trap.
It is. And what makes this so incredibly painful for the individual is a clinical concept called insight.
Insight, right? Like how aware they are.
Exactly. The vast majority of adults with OCD have good or fair insight. They know their rituals are irrational.
They know it makes no sense.
Yes. They are fully aware that, say, tapping a door frame 3 times won't actually prevent a car crash. They just feel they have to act as though these ideas are realistic to fend off the sheer dread they are experiencing.
That sounds absolutely exhausting.
Yeah.
Like living with a brain that is forcing you to do things, make no logical sense.
It's agonizing for them.
But the sources noted that about 4% of people with OCD have what's called no insight.
Right, about 4%.
Where they are, completely convinced their obsessive beliefs are true, which borders on delusional and can sometimes look like a psychotic disorder.
Yes, the lines can get blurry in severe cases without insight.
But let me push back for a second, because I think a lot of people listening might be wondering, what is the actual line between OCD and just being a severe perfectionist?
Oh, that's a great question.
Like someone who has extremely rigid rules for how their life and their house should look. Where do we draw that line?
Well, what's fascinating here is the psychological distinction between 2 very specific terms, ego-dystonic and ego-syntonic.
Ego what?
Ego-dystonic. OCD is an ego-dystonic disorder.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It means the intrusive thoughts and the compulsions are entirely inconsistent with the person's true self-concept. They go against who the person wants to be, which is exactly why they cause so much distress.
Ah, I get it. An ego-dystonic thought feels like an alien invader in your own mind.
Yeah.
You hate it. You don't want it there.
Perfectly said. Now compare that to obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD, which is a separate condition entirely.
Right, OCPD.
OCPD is ego-syntonic. People with OCPD believe that their rigid rules, their perfectionism, and their extreme need for control are correct and rational.
So they like being that way.
Exactly. They accept these traits as a core part of their self-image. They will readily explain to you why their way of doing things is the right way, and they might even derive a sense of pride or pleasure from it.
Oh, wow. So the person with OCD is basically a hostage to their own brain, while the person with OCPD thinks everyone else should just be following their rules.
That distinction is huge, yes.
Now that we understand that loop, the obsession, the anxiety, the compulsion, the temporary relief, and the reinforcement, we need to look at how this manifests in the real world.
Because it is rarely just about hand washing or organizing books.
Right. The researchers identified 4 main symptom clusters to sort of categorize the disorder.
Yeah, so the first is the symmetry factor. This involves obsessions related to ordering, counting, and symmetry, paired with repeating compulsions.
Just that need for things to feel like just right.
Exactly, the just right feeling. Then the second is the cleaning factor, which is what most people picture. Obsessions about contamination and germs leading to compulsive washing.
Right, the classic portrayal.
Then the third is the hoarding factor, involving obsessions and compulsions specifically related to acquiring and saving items, often to the point of severe dysfunction.
Okay, then there's the 4th cluster called the forbidden thoughts factor. And here's where it gets really interesting and honestly, quite dark.
It is very dark.
This isn't about germs at all. This involves highly intrusive thoughts of a violent, religious, or sexual nature.
Yes, and people don't talk about this one as much.
There's a specific manifestation called scrupulosity. This is a pathological, crushing guilt or anxiety about moral or religious issues. The person is basically consumed by the fear that they are fundamentally evil, or that they are going to face divine retribution for some perceived sin.
These thoughts can be deeply disturbing for the patient. And there are also sexual obsessions. One manifestation is POCD, or pedophilia-themed OCD.
That sounds absolutely terrifying to deal with.
It is. A person's brain bombards them with the obsessive fear that they might be or might become a pedophile. Remember the concept of ego-dystonic thoughts we just talked about?
Right, the alien invader.
Yes. These intrusive images are the exact opposite of what the person actually values. They are abhorrent to them.
So the OCD creates this intense, agonizing doubt. The person experiences what looks like a crisis of sexual identity, accompanied by profound self-loathing, just because of a misfiring brain.
It's a terrifying invisible struggle.
And that constant doubting of your own fundamental nature that naturally bleeds over into doubting your basic reality. There is a phenomenon mentioned in the sources called memory distrust.
Oh, memory distrust is huge.
You constantly doubt your own perception and memory, even when there's no evidence you're actually forgetting things. You literally don't trust what you just saw or did.
And that intense self-doubt forces the person into checking compulsions. You check the stove 10 times, not because you forgot you turned it off, but because the OCD actively degrades your trust in your own memory of turning it off.
It gets even more hidden than that, though. The data says as many as 50 to 60% of cases might be characterized as primarily obsessional OCD.
Often called pure O.
Yeah, pure O. In these cases, the compulsions are almost entirely mental. There's no overt hand-washing or checking logs.
Not at all.
The person performs mental rituals like excessive rumination, constantly reviewing past events in their head to prove to themselves they aren't a bad person, or engaging in extreme mental avoidance.
And to the outside world, this person looks completely fine, while internally they are fighting an absolute war.
But if the symptoms can be entirely mental, measuring the severity has got to be so tough. How do doctors even measure something so subjective?
Well, it requires a specialized tool. The clinical gold standard is the Yale-Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Scale, or the YBOCS.
Low IBOCS, okay.
It goes beyond just asking what the symptoms are. It actually quantifies the suffering. It measures how much time the rituals take up, the level of distress they cause, how much control the person feels they have, and how much the symptoms interfere with daily functioning.
We really need to underline the level of that suffering because the tragic comorbidity associated with this disorder is staggering.
The statistics are heartbreaking.
Over 50% of people with OCD experience suicidal tendencies, and 15% attempt suicide.
Yeah, 15%.
The immense distress of these forbidden thoughts, the constant anxiety, and the frequent co-occurrence of major depressive disorder just make this an incredibly heavy burden.
It is a devastating reality for so many people.
So, with the severity of the symptoms so clearly established, the natural next question for anyone listening is why? Why does the human brain do this to itself?
The causes are multifactorial, meaning there is no single smoking gun. But we can definitely start with genetics.
Okay, let's talk genetics.
OCD is highly familial, estimated to be about 50% heritable.
Wow, 50%.
Yeah. A major genome-wide association study identified 30 significant genetic loci and 25 likely causal genes. They really highlighted specific genes like WDR6, DELOD3, and CTNND1.
So the genetic architecture is definitely there.
Very much so.
Right.
And it overlaps significantly with things like anxiety, depression, and Tourette syndrome.
The genetic blueprint sets the stage, sure, but what is actually happening physically inside the brain to create that feeling of impending doom? Like, how does a gene turn into an obsession?
We have to look at the brain's structural loops, specifically the corticostriato-thalamocortical circuit.
Okay, that is quite a mouthful.
It is. Think of this circuit like a gearbox that helps manage threat detection and action. The cortex detects a potential issue, say, a strange spot on your hand.
It's like the Scout.
Right. It sends a signal to the striatum, which normally acts like a brake pedal, deciding if this threat is actually worth acting on. If it is, the signal goes to the thalamus, the action center, telling you to wash your hands.
Okay, so in a neurotypical brain, you wash your hands, the thalamus sends a signal back saying threat resolved, and the striatum hits the brakes.
Exactly. But in an OCD brain, that circuit is hyperactive. The striatum fails to apply the brakes.
Oh, no.
The thalamus gets continuously flooded with the threat signal. The gearbox gets jammed in the threat-detected position.
Just stuck on red alert.
Yes. And this structural hyperactivity is paired with a dysregulation of key neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers in the brain. Glutamate, which is a major excitatory neurotransmitter, essentially the brain's gas pedal, is running too high in these circuits.
Pushing things too fast.
Right. Meanwhile, serotonin, which helps regulate mood and emotional response, isn't functioning efficiently enough to help calm the system down.
So the hardware is jammed and the chemical software is constantly hitting the gas pedal. That's a perfect storm.
It really is.
Okay, so if someone has these genes and these structural vulnerabilities, is it just a ticking time bomb? Or does something in the world actually flip the switch to trigger the disorder?
Environmental factors play a massive role. Severe childhood trauma, abuse, or neglect are significant risk factors. Major life stressors like bereavement or even the hormonal shifts of childbirth can trigger the onset.
I found this next part from the sources genuinely surprising. The clinical data shows that OCD can actually be drug-induced.
Yeah, that shocks a lot of people.
Exposure to certain toxins or drugs, like methamphetamine or cocaine, can induce obsessive-compulsive symptoms in people who have absolutely no history of the disorder.
Because of how they mess with the brain's chemistry.
Even certain prescription medications, specifically atypical antipsychotics like olanzapine, can sometimes trigger OCD symptoms in patients being treated for schizophrenia.
It just highlights how delicate that neurotransmitter balance really is. Altering dopamine or serotonin pathways with a substance can inadvertently jam that gearbox we just talked about.
And that delicate balance is really obvious when you look at the pediatric autoimmune connection. PANDAS.
Wow, yes, PANDAS.
Pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infections. A kid gets a common strep infection.
It's just normal strep throat.
Right. But instead of just a sore throat, their immune system gets confused and mounts an autoimmune response that mistakenly attacks the basal ganglia in their own brain.
It turns on itself.
And this leads to a sudden, almost overnight onset of severe OCD symptoms and entics. Literally overnight. They go to bed with a fever and wake up unable to stop washing their hands. It proves how profoundly neurological this is.
It is a stark reminder that this is a physical condition manifesting through behavioral symptoms.
Let me step back for a second, though, and ask you a foundational, almost philosophical question.
Sure, go for it.
If evolution optimizes for survival and weeds out traits that are harmful, why would evolution let a genetic vulnerability survive that causes you to wash your hands until they literally bleed?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, evolutionary psychologists have a very compelling theory here.
Okay.
They postulate that moderate versions of these compulsive behaviors were actually massive evolutionary advantages for early humans.
How so?
Think about our ancestors. Moderate, constant checking of the environment for enemies kept you alive. Checking the hearth to make sure the fire wasn't going to burn down your shelter kept you alive.
That makes sense.
Hoarding resources meant you survived a brutal winter. Hypervigilance about hygiene and contamination protected your tribe from disease before humanity even knew what a germ was.
So a little bit of anxiety and checking was essentially a superpower. The caveman who checked the bushes 3 times didn't get eaten by the tiger.
Exactly. In this view, OCD might just be the extreme statistical tale of these ancient, highly successful survival mechanisms. The genes that made our ancestors cautious and prepared are the exact same genes that, when turned up too high, result in clinical OCD.
That completely reframes the disorder for me. It is not a weakness. It's a survival instinct that has gone completely rogue.
A very good way to look at it.
But if OCD is this ancient evolutionary mechanism acting like a stuck car alarm, how do modern humans actually stop it? What does the research say actually breaks the loop?
Well, the good news is that we have highly effective treatments. The gold standard first-line psychological treatment is a specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy known as exposure and response prevention, or ERP.
Exposure and response prevention. How does that actually rewire that jammed gearbox?
Well, it requires immense courage from the patient. The person is gradually exposed to the very thing that triggers their obsession.
Like touching a doorknob they believe is contaminated or checking a lock just one single time?
Yes. But the critical part is they are instructed to prevent the response. They cannot perform the compulsion. They touch the doorknob and they sit there without washing their hands.
Oh, man. That sounds like absolute torture for someone whose brain is screaming at them that they're going to die if they don't wash.
It is incredibly difficult initially. The anxiety skyrockets because the brain is hitting that glutamate gas pedal hard.
Right.
But by sitting with that anxiety and not performing the ritual, they teach their brain a new reality. The brain learns that the anxiety will eventually subside on its own without the compulsion, and that the dreaded outcome didn't actually happen.
So over time, the OCD loop weakens.
Yes, they are essentially forcing the striatum to learn how to pump the brakes again.
They are rewiring the alarm system by proving to the brain that the alarm is fake.
Exactly.
I also want to talk about a newer form of cognitive therapy gaining traction specifically for OCD called inference-based therapy, or IBT. The sources mentioned this focuses on a concept called inferential confusion.
Inferential confusion is fascinating. It suggests that people with OCD put more emphasis on an imagined possibility than on what they can actually perceive with their physical senses.
Let's walk through what that actually feels like. Say I lock my front door. I turn the deadbolt. I physically see it turn and hear it click.
You have the physical sensory data.
Right. But I get down the street and my brain says, did I actually lock it? Maybe the bolt didn't slide all the way into the frame.
Under normal circumstances, you would recall the physical sensory experience of turning the key, you'd trust that memory, and dismiss the thought.
Yeah.
But in inferential confusion, the imagined possibility, the vivid mental story of a burglar walking through an unlocked door, it feels more credible than the sensory memory of the metal clicking into place.
Wow.
You start trusting a hypothetical narrative over your own physical senses. You confuse the what if with the what is.
So what does this all mean for treatment? IBT sounds like teaching the patient to become a detective in their own mind. You have to learn to trust the actual physical evidence of the room, the visual fact that the deadbolt is turned, rather than the suspect whispering in your head that it might not be.
That is a brilliant analogy. IBT aims to reorient the client toward trusting their senses and relating to reality in a normal, non-effortful way, rather than getting lost in the labyrinth of imagined possibilities.
That's incredible.
And this raises an important question for all of us, honestly, even without an OCD diagnosis. How often do we confuse our own imagined anxieties with actual reality?
We probably all do it to some extent.
Definitely. How often do we let a terrifying what if override the concrete reality of what is actually happening in front of us?
That's a really powerful thought. But alongside these therapies, medication obviously plays a massive role in helping the brain calm down enough to even engage in that therapy, right?
Yeah. The first-line pharmacological treatments are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, like sertraline and fluoxetine.
Which tackle the serotonin issue.
Right. By keeping more serotonin active in the brain, it helps strengthen those braking mechanisms in the corticostriatothalamo-cortical circuit. The data clearly shows that combining ERP therapy with an SSRI often yields the best results, especially in moderate to severe cases.
But there are cases that are treatment resistant. What happens when therapy and SSRIs just aren't enough to unjam the gears?
Clinicians can turn to second-line medications like clomicramine or augmenting the SSRI with an atypical antipsychotic.
And if it's still resistant?
If it is still resistant, the FDA has approved transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which uses targeted magnetic fields to stimulate nerve cells in the brain and try to reset those hyperactive circuits.
Magnets on the brain, basically.
Essentially, yes. And as an absolute last resort, for the most severe intractable cases, there are surgical options like deep brain stimulation, which involves implanting actual electrodes in specific brain areas, or even psychosurgery, involving highly targeted alterations to brain tissue.
Just the fact that brain surgery is on the table really emphasizes just how severe and biological this condition is.
It is a chronic condition, and completely symptom-free periods are uncommon. But with proper dedicated treatment, the reduction in symptoms is significant and the quality of life improves drastically for the vast majority of patients.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thank you for joining us as we explored this material.
It was a pleasure.
If there's one thing to take away today for you listening, it is that OCD is not a quirky personality trait. It's not about being tidy or preferring your pens lined up.
From it.
It is a profound, often entirely hidden neurological battle. It involves extreme psychological distress, real genetic vulnerabilities, and survival instincts that have been hijacked. Knowing that changes how we talk about it, and it changes how we support the millions of people fighting that invisible loop every single day.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with a final thought, building on what we've discussed. If the evolutionary psychologists are right, if OCD traits stem from ancient survival mechanisms like hypervigilance, checking for danger, and hoarding resources to survive the winter, What happens when those ancient instincts meet our modern digital world?
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating collision.
Think about it. Could the infinite scroll, the constant compulsive checking of our notifications, the fear of missing an important alert, or the digital hoarding of thousands of emails and photos be exploiting the exact same neural pathways that used to keep us safe from predators?
Just hacking the system.
Are our devices hacking our ancient survival loops, keeping that striatum from ever pumping the brakes? It is something for you to mull over the next time you feel a sudden, inexplicable urge to compulsively check your phone.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So if you've ever been in London, in Bloomsbury,
Yeah.
you just can't miss it. There's this colossus.
This sort of neoclassical temple.
Exactly. A temple that holds, well, pretty much the history of everything. And it's a place that promises universal knowledge, but is now, right at the center of some really heated debates about ownership and history.
We are definitely opening the doors to the British Museum today, and our mission here is to take you beyond just the display cases to really understand its truly revolutionary origins and then track its monumental and often very controversial growth.
And then grapple with the firestorms that seem to define it now in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about this place, we have to start with the sheer size. I mean, this is not just a gallery, it's a behemoth. Give us the numbers right off the bat.
The magnitude is, well, it's undeniable. It was established way back in 1753, which makes it the world's first public national museum, a completely radical idea for its time.
The first one.
The very first. And its whole founding principle was that collections should be held, in perpetuity for the public and free of charge. Today, the scale is barely comprehensible. The permanent collection holds approximately 8 million objects.
8 million.
8 million! It is the largest collection of its kind documenting human history, art, and culture anywhere on the planet.
That's a staggering figure. And yet we know only a tiny fraction of that is ever actually on display.
Exactly. And despite all the modern debates, public engagement is still colossal. In 2023 alone, the museum welcomed over 5.8 million visitors. So it's consistently one of the most visited institutions in the world. People want to hear the stories these objects tell.
So let's unpack that. How do you get from this, radical idea to an 8 million object titan? You have to start with the man whose obsession basically birthed the whole thing, Sir Hans Sloane.
Sir Hans Sloane is, without a doubt, the cornerstone. He was an Anglo-Irish physician, a natural scientist, and he lived through the late 17th and early 18th centuries.
Okay.
And he leveraged his successful medical career, and this is significant, the huge wealth he got through his marriage to the widow of a wealthy Jamaican planter to fuel this lifelong, relentless passion for collecting. He was the absolute epitome of the Enlightenment era collector of curiosities.
So what did curiosities actually mean back in the 1700s? Was it just, scientific specimens, or did he already have that kind of universal scope in mind?
It was startlingly universal. By the time he died in 1753, Sloane had amassed around 71,000 individual items. And it wasn't just, stuffed animals and minerals. It was a real mix.
Right.
You're talking 40,000 printed books, 7,000 manuscripts, but also these extensive natural history specimens, including 337 huge volumes of dried plants. But the key thing for the British Museum's later identity is that his collection already included classical antiquities from Greece and Rome, Egyptian relics, and material from the Americas.
So it was already a mini universal museum in itself.
It really was.
And here's the critical pivot, the thing that defines the institution. He transfers it to the nation.
Yeah.
But he didn't just donate it, did he? He made it an astonishingly good deal for the public.
Absolutely. Sloane was obsessed with keeping his life's work intact. He did not want his heirs breaking it up and selling it off piece by piece. So in his will, he bequeathed the entire collection to King George II for the nation.
Okay, but there was a condition.
There was. The stipulation was that Parliament pay his heirs £20,000. Now that sounds like a lot, but contemporary estimates valued his collection at £80,000, maybe even more. He was intentionally subsidizing the deal to make sure it was permanent and public.
So Parliament agrees, and on June 7th, 1753, the British Museum is formally established by an Act of Parliament. But wasn't founded only on Sloane's collection, was it? They immediately added some literary powerhouses.
And that decision was foundational. It was brilliant. The 1753 Act immediately integrated two other massive literary collections, the Cottonian Library and the Harleian Library. This wasn't just adding books, this was adding centuries of national history. And then, just 4 years later, in 1757, they added the ultimate collection, the Old Royal Library, which had been assembled by British monarchs over generations.
So suddenly you have irreplaceable texts, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the only surviving manuscript of Beowulf inside the walls of this new public museum.
Exactly. This radical blend of natural history, global antiquities, and this profound literary heritage, that is what defined the concept of the Universal Museum from day one.
And where did they put all of this?
Yeah.
This colossal trove needed a home, and it definitely wasn't the building we see today.
No, their first home was Montague House, a converted 17th century mansion in Bloomsbury. It took them 6 years to get it ready, but in 1759, the British Museum opened its doors to the public.
So what was that experience like, visiting the first national public museum? It wasn't exactly a walking off the street kind of deal, was it?
Far from it. I mean, this was still the 18th century. To get in, you had to apply for a ticket, usually weeks in advance, and you had to be decently dressed. And once you were inside, visitors were ushered through in these small, supervised groups. You were basically hurried past the objects. It was more about proving the collection existed than allowing for any kind of deep study.
And yet, even with that structure, the museum quickly starts to pivot its focus. It moves away from Sloane's emphasis on natural history and books, and more toward the big archaeological finds we associate with it today.
The shift starts subtly, but it picks up pace quickly. In 1772, they acquire Sir William Hamilton's first collection of Greek vases, and that really elevated the classical antiquities profile.
And then come the objects that just electrify the public imagination.
Right.
The material from Captain James Cook's South Seas voyages.
Yes, the Cook voyages, starting in 1778, delivered thousands of objects from the Pacific, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia. This influx was so crucial because it introduced the public to cultures that were contemporary but, completely unknown to Europe. It really set the stage for the monumental collecting that would define the next century.
And as we cross into the 19th century, the pace of acquisition just accelerates exponentially. It's no longer just about gentlemen collectors. Now it's about state policy, military power, huge expeditions. This is when the British Museum truly becomes global.
This is the era of giants. And we have to start with the Egyptian collection. The events around the Battle of the Nile were just critical. They transformed the museum into the world's leading center for Egyptian history almost overnight.
So after Napoleon's defeat in 1801, what happens to all the Egyptian artifacts the French had collected?
They become spoils of war. The British military acquired a huge number of them. And then, in 1802, King George III makes one of the most significant presentations in the museum's history. The iconic Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone, arguably the most famous piece of rock in the world. Why was its arrival so immediately transformative?
Because of its function. It had the same decree inscribed in 3 different scripts: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic, and ancient Greek. Its arrival gave scholars the key, the definitive code, to finally decipher hieroglyphs, a language that had been dead for over 1,400 years.
Oh.
The institution that held that stone became the undisputed global authority on ancient Egypt.
And that collection just kept growing, largely thanks to figures like Henry Salt, the British consul general in Egypt.
Salt was a tireless collector. He amassed huge quantities of antiquities. This included the terrifyingly huge, colossal bust of Ramesses II, which arrived in 1818. I mean, just imagine the logistics in the early 19th century of moving a multi-ton granite head from Luxor all the way to London.
Which brings us to another monumental and certainly its most contested acquisition, the Parthenon sculptures.
The Parthenon sculptures, famously known as the Elgin marbles, they are just essential to understanding this era. They were removed from the Acropolis in Athens by the 7th Earl of Elgin between 1801 and 1812.
When Greece was under Ottoman rule.
Correct. Elgin claimed he had permission from the Ottoman authorities, a claim that is still highly contested today.
So how did they get from Elgin's private property into the national collection?
Well, Elgin fell into debt and faced a huge amount of public criticism. After a really rigorous parliamentary inquiry, Parliament voted to purchase the collection for £35,000 in 1816. Their arrival just solidified the museum's role as the custodian of what was seen as the peak of classical Western civilization.
And it wasn't just the Mediterranean. The Middle Eastern collections also really start to take shape around this time.
Absolutely. But the real game changer came in the 1840s, with archaeologists like Austin Henry Layard excavating in what is now modern-day Iraq at sites like Nimrud and Nineveh.
And his finds were just dramatic, weren't they?
They were stunning. Colossal palace reliefs, these monumental winged bulls, the Lamassu, and most significantly, the accidental discovery of the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal.
The Royal Library. Tell us more about that, because that wasn't just a few scrolls.
No, it was a whole archive. Layard and his team recovered around 130,000 cuneiform tablets. It covered every aspect of Assyrian life: literature, mathematics, astronomy, and crucially, versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This made the museum the global focal point for Assyrian studies.
Okay, so with all these colossal statues and 130,000 clay tablets arriving, not to mention all the books, Montague House was just...
It was completely overwhelmed. The old mansion had to go. Starting in 1823, they began construction on Sir Robert Smirke's grand neoclassical design, the one we know today.
with that incredible Greek Revival facade and the 43 huge Ionic columns.
Exactly. And the sculpture over the main entrance, the pediment, was called the Progress of Civilization. The building itself was designed to project the museum's new status as a global power. It became a monument to the very history it contained.
But even that new building couldn't keep up. Space became a problem almost instantly, especially for the library.
The collection was just too large for one building. The first major attempt to solve this was architectural brilliance. The Round Reading Room. Designed by Sidney Smirke, it opened in 1857. A cast-iron marvel capped by a dome that was, at the time, the second widest in the world after the Pantheon.
And it was designed to hold 1 million books. But even that wasn't enough. The whole idea of everything under one roof was becoming unsustainable.
It was, and that led to necessary splits. The first major one involved the natural history collections. By the 1880s, they needed their own space and were moved to a new building in South Kensington. That became the Natural History Museum, fully independent by 1963.
And the second split was the massive literary heart of the museum.
That was the British Library. By the mid-20th century, the sheer volume of books was just astronomical. The British Library Act of 1972 officially created it as a separate entity. It took another quarter century, but in 1997, the books and manuscripts, including Beowulf and everything from the Round Reading Room, finally moved to their new home at St. Pancras.
So how did losing those two huge collections change the British Museum's identity?
It finalized it. After 1997, its mission became entirely focused on humanity's journey through objects, from prehistory to the present. It became a specialized global cultural historian.
Which brings us back to that colossal figure, 8 million objects. We know less than 1% is on display. The real depth is in the research departments.
Absolutely. To truly appreciate the scale, you have to look past the main exhibition halls.
So let's give our listeners a sense of that depth. Let's start with the Africa, Oceania, and the Americas department.
Well, that department alone is over 350,000 objects. It's immense. And when you walk into the Great Court, one of the first things you see is the Kayung totem pole.
The giant totem pole, impossible to miss.
Exactly. It's a colossal cedar pole from the Haida Gwaii in Canada. It tells an entire family's ancestral history. It's a breathtaking example of monumental indigenous art.
And from Oceania, there's the Ho'ohakanaya, the Moai statue, which is maybe the most spiritually charged piece from the Pacific.
Indeed. It's one of the monumental Moai statues from Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, removed in 1868. For the Rapa Nui people, its removal caused real spiritual distress. Its claim for return is one of the most emotionally charged repatriation claims the museum faces.
Of course. And the African collections, they include the famed Benin bronzes.
Yes, the Benin bronzes metal plaques looted during a punitive expedition in 1897 are central to the Devat, but the collection also has these incredibly sophisticated works from across the continent, showing thousand-year traditions of metallurgy and art.
Okay, let's pivot back to Britain and Europe. What's the anchor piece there?
For early medieval Britain, it has to be the magnificent Sutton Hoo treasure.
The Anglo-Saxon ship burial, found right before World War II.
Yes, in 1939, the quality of the artifacts, the golden helmet, the belt buckle, it provided this unparalleled insight into early 7th century high culture. It basically rewrote the history books on the so-called Dark Ages.
And for sheer technical brilliance from the Roman era, you have to mention the Lycurgus Cup.
Oh, it's an engineering marvel. It's a unique figurative glass cup, and it's made of what we call dichroic glass.
Right, so it changes color.
Exactly. It looks jade green when lit from the front, but when light shines through it from behind, it glows this vivid, deep ruby red. It must have seemed like pure magic.
Finally, let's go east to the Department of Asia.
The scope there is just breathtaking. Over 75,000 objects. A highlight from India are the monumental Amaravati sculptures, which are crucial for understanding early Buddhist art.
And the Japanese and Chinese collections are considered some of the best outside of Asia.
That's true. The Japanese collection is particularly renowned for its prints.
Which brings us to a specific highlight everyone would recognize. Hogosai's The Great Wave off Kanagawa.
It's one of the most reproduced images in world art. And what's crucial is that the British Museum holds 3 of the original woodblock impressions. Because the blocks wear out so quickly, having multiple early high-quality prints is a real rarity.
So as we move into the modern era, the museum undergoes a huge architectural change and confronts some very intense modern challenges.
It really does. The architectural shift was spurred by the British Library leaving in 1997. That left this massive hole in the middle of the building.
The central quadrangle.
Right, and it was redeveloped into the Queen Elizabeth II Great Court, which opened in 2000. It's now the largest covered public square in Europe, with that incredible glass and steel roof.
It's a stunning space.
Yeah.
But it also highlights the museum's governance. Who actually runs this colossal ship today?
Well, there's a director, but the ultimate control falls to a 25-member board of trustees. And here's the key part. 15 of those trustees are appointed directly by the Prime Minister.
And that structure is vital, because it leads us straight into the ongoing repatriation debate.
It's the central issue. The museum's official position often points to the British Museum Act of 1963, which legally prevents them from disposing of collection items.
So they argue their hands are tied.
Essentially, yes. The argument is that mass repatriation would fundamentally threaten the whole concept of the Universal Museum. You know, it would empty the great museums of the world.
But critics say that's a bit of a shield, right? That Parliament could just change the act if it wanted to.
That is precisely the counter-argument, that it's a matter of political will, not legal impossibility. The debate is really trapped between the museum's current legal framework and the political will to change it.
Let's just run through the 4 most contested artifacts. We have to start with the Parthenon marbles.
The claim from Greece is relentless, and it's supported by UNESCO. They argue the sculptures were removed illegally and are an essential part of their national identity.
Then the Rosetta Stone, claimed by Egypt.
Egypt's position is that the stone was acquired as a direct result of military conquest. It's seen as an irreplaceable piece of their national heritage and a reminder of that historical power imbalance.
Next, the hundreds of Benin bronzes, claimed by Nigeria.
Nigeria's claim is unique because the items were systematically looted during that 1897 punitive expedition. They view them as proof of a crime committed against their people.
And finally, the Hoa Hakanaya Moai statue.
This is a spiritual claim from Chile on behalf of the Rapa Nui community. Their argument is that the Moai are ancestors, not objects, and their physical absence affects the spiritual well-being of the island.
And even while wrestling with all that, the museum is still generating controversy around its modern relationships, like its sponsorship deals.
This is a classic conflict. In late 2023, the museum renewed a huge $50 million sponsorship deal with the oil company BP.
Which immediately drew fire.
Intense criticism, yes. From environmental groups, even staff members who argued that accepting funds from a major oil producer just compromises the museum's commitment to a sustainable future.
And then there was another totally different controversy over terminology.
Yes, in early 2025, they were criticized for using the term Xizang for Tibet.
Why is that controversial?
Xizang is the preferred term of the Chinese government. Critics argue that using it validates the political narrative of the current government and effectively ignores the historical and cultural identity of the Tibetan people.
And speaking of immediate crisis, we have to talk about the devastating security scandal that erupted in 2023. This was a massive institutional failure.
This is a catastrophic failure of trust. It turned out a long-standing staff member had been systematically stealing items, gold jewelry, gems, small artifacts over a significant period. The estimated loss was about 2,000 items.
And the most shocking part was where some of these invaluable objects ended up.
They were being sold online, sometimes on eBay, for ridiculously cheap prices.
Yeah.
The idea that thousands of items could be removed and offloaded like that by an insider was just a huge blow to the museum's reputation as a secure custodian.
And they'd been warned about it, hadn't they?
Yes, the inadequate internal response was what led to the director's resignation. The failure wasn't just the theft, but the failure to act on credible warnings. They've recovered over 600 items, but the damage was done.
So this monumental failure forces the museum to confront a massive technological overhaul.
That is the silver lining, if you can call it that. The immediate consequence of the theft crisis was the museum committing to an accelerated digitalization program. They announced a comprehensive 5-year plan to digitize the complete collection. All 8 million objects.
All 8 million. That is an astronomical commitment.
It's an unprecedented leap. The plan is to add millions of new, fully documented entries and photographs, ensuring that every single object, from the Parthenon marbles to the smallest shard of pottery, has a digital footprint that is publicly accessible. A security crisis has effectively catalyzed a massive leap toward global digital accessibility.
We've traced this immense journey of the British Museum, from one man's private collection, intended for the public good, to this colossal institution that is now home to 8 million artifacts and stands as a monument to collecting human history.
And today, it's navigating the choppy waters of that legacy. It has to balance being a free, universal museum with the very complex ethical demands of its colonial-era collecting. And at the same time, it has to fix the profound internal security breaches that were exposed by those thefts.
So what does this all mean for the very concept of a universal museum in this digital age?
I think the most profound transformation is that 5-year push to put all 8 million objects online. This means the knowledge, the history, the detailed images, they're all becoming freely available to anyone in the world, independent of the physical building.
Which raises a crucial question for the museum and for you listening. When the definitive knowledge and images of a national treasure are freely accessible online in every corner of the world.
Does that act of radical transparency fundamentally change what it means to own that treasure? Is the future of the Universal Museum defined by its physical location or by its new role as a global digital knowledge repository?
A profound shift from a brick-and-mortar structure to a global data engine. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the heart of the British Museum.